Now, while young men and women are serving in various positions in the war abroad, there is a massive wartime economy that is booming in the United States. And war historically has improved the economy. War mobilization ended the Great Depression as 3.8 million workers were added to the federal government, and the national budget and gross national product, union membership rolls, and enlistment in the armed forces skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. The United States was consumed by economic growth, with auto factories, rubber companies, oil refineries, steel mills, and textile and shoe factories all providing supplies to fight or furnish the war. Americans moved about the country to participate in industries, and all regions boomed as they specialized in various aspects of war production. The South, for example, saw an influx in federal money to support military camps. Textile industries that produced uniforms and port cities where battleships were built were all launched in the South. The West Coast provided access to the Pacific and thus became an increasing strategic importance to the United States, fueling the growth of airplanes and shipyards in Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. Congress gave the president the authority to reorganize the government agencies as he saw fit for the sake of the war effort. Congress really gave FDR unprecedented power to redesign the government in whatever way would best impact the United States' ability to be successful in World War II. In 1942, FDR created the War Production Board for the sole purpose of managing the economy. The board offered incentives to businesses for supporting the war industry, and that included lowering taxes, assistance with costs, and the promise of increased revenue, and corporate net profits begin to double during the Second World War. The first part of the war saw American factories increase exponentially, supplying over half of the world's manufactured goods and demonstrating the possibilities for rapid production, with plants that were completing a ship a day and an airplane every 5 minutes. Government spending in World War II amounted to more than $320 billion. This was sourced by war bonds, tax increase rates across all economic brackets, and inflation, all of which had an impact on the financial well-being of ordinary Americans. By the end of the war, more than 12 million men and women had either enlisted or drafted for the war. This was a dramatic increase from the 250,000 members in 1940. The diversity of the military reflected the diversity of the American population, as the U.S. Armed Forces included men and women, but primarily men, from recent immigrant families, Americans with deep roots in the United States, gay men, African Americans who confronted a segregated military. Women joined the Women's Army Corps, the WWII. The women accepted for voluntary emergency service, the WAVES, in droves. Women in these and other service branches performed clerical, medical, and transportation duties. The growth of the military created a labor shortage that fueled union membership and led Roosevelt to organize the National War Labor Board, which regulated labor conditions and authorized the government to step in at plants that did not comply with the board's decision. Now, this was particularly important because Congress could not afford for workers to become frustrated and strike, because if they did, that would decrease the production and have a negative impact on the war effort. Congress responded to a small spike in strikes in 1943 by passing the Smith-Connolly Act, which established a 30-day cooling off period before people who were members of unions could strike. And it also forbid workers from just walking out of any job if that job was important for national defense. Now, the war brought a lot of new opportunities for women as well as for African Americans to serve in the military. In particular, women found new work opportunities over the course of the Second World War. They found these opportunities in areas that had primarily been dominated by men who were now deployed. The absence of men from the labor force actually fostered a 141% growth in the number of women in manufacturing and a 436% growth in the number of women working in war industries. Women saw an increased wages as industry jobs paid much better than clerical jobs, sales and service jobs, because those industry jobs were jobs that were supporting the war effort. Women had traditionally worked in low-paying fields, but the number of women working in those fields of domestic service, those low-paying jobs, decreased by 20% during the war. So we see a lot of new and important opportunities for women. Older women were more likely to join the workforce than women with young children because the government really did nothing to provide childcare. Women who did find manufacturing work still made significantly lower wages than men, and they were less likely to be promoted. So while there are opportunities for women, there is not equal treatment for women. Though the image of the strong and forceful Rosie Riveter dominated the popular representations of working women, most employers pitched jobs to women by comparing the work that they would be doing to household labor. And most women were viewed by their employers as temporary employees just through the end of the war. Now, the government established the Office of War Information, which was similar to the Committee on Public Information during World War I. And this Office of War Information promoted the war effort across American society. The domestic war effort included collecting scrap metal and rubber that was found at schools, planting what was called a victory garden at home, and then running social events as fundraisers, and then also gasoline rationing, meat rationing, and rationing of butter and sugar. That is very similar to the Wheatless Mondays and the Meatless Tuesdays that we saw in World War I. Films highlighted particular aspects of the war, portraying American servicemen in Guadalcanal and Bataan as heroes. Movies like Mission to Moscow and Casablanca offered audiences the opportunity to explore the theme of the war through personal, political, and social lenses. At home, family life began to shift. Many Americans moved during the war, with more and more mothers and fathers working outside of the home. This led children to become what was called latchkey kids. And as a result, this facilitated a rise in juvenile delinquency. And these latchkey kids really, they were responsible for getting home after school and taking care of themselves, doing their homework and chores without mom there to greet them when they got home. As a result of this lack of parental supervision, we see an increase in juvenile delinquency. As the war began to wind down in 1945 and servicemen returned home, women who had been in the waves and the walk returned to their homes, we see a dramatic increase in the birth rate. This signals what is known as the baby boom. Now, I mentioned the Office of War Information. So I wanted to share some of the advertisements that they might put out. This one is a recruitment poster and it says, "Women in the war, we can't win without them." And so it's really encouraging women to take on these industry jobs so that the men on the front lines will have the munitions and supplies that they need to be successful. But what's very interesting is that this image here still shows this woman with her hair done and in an outfit that is most likely a dress. So even though women are being encouraged to go into the workforce, there are still some expectations that women will still dress a certain way and conduct themselves a certain way. Now, this advertisement is similar to the other. We do see a woman in pants or overall, so that probably indicates that she's working in an industry in an area that has always been male dominated. But you can see that her hair is done and she looks nice. And so again, this is signaling that even though women are working in these different industries, that they are still to conduct themselves as women. We see a daughter here. Remember, the mindset is that the mother is a model for how daughters should live. With this advertisement, we see, "Mother, when will you stay home again?" So there's this gentle reminder here that when the war is over, right, and things return to normal, that mom will stay home with the children and dad will go back to the job that he held before the war. Now, as the war wages on in Europe, there is a different type of war taking place in the United States. And this is really led by men like A. Philip Randolph, who seek to seize upon the momentum of fighting for the liberation of oppressed people in Germany or in German occupied areas, and fighting for the oppressed people in Japan controlled areas, to fight for people who do not receive equal treatment here in the United States. In June of 1941, so before the United States officially enters into the Second World War, longtime labor leader A. Philip Randolph announced that he would lead a 100,000 African American people march in Washington, D.C. to protest segregation and discrimination in these various efforts. Now, Roosevelt fears that if Philip Randolph leads this, 1,000 African American march on DC, that it will undermine the war effort, which is underway in Europe. And Roosevelt is afraid that this will make the United States look weak if people in the United States are fighting for something that they don't really enjoy. So Roosevelt doesn't want this march to happen because it will embarrass the U.S. forces. Remember, the U.S. forces, African Americans who are serving in segregated units, are fighting for democracy in Europe, but they don't enjoy the full benefits of democracy here in the United States. Roosevelt and Randolph worked out a compromise. And in exchange for Randolph calling off the march, the president issued Executive Order 8802, which established the Fair Employment Practice Committee, which banned job discrimination in war industries. And in spite of its limited effectiveness, provided African Americans with job opportunities. But Roosevelt refused to desegregate the military. Black leaders used the context of the war to inaugurate what was called a double V campaign. That's double V for victory. It would signify the fight to achieve victory over racism at home and abroad. And civil rights organizations saw some of the most important triumphs for their cause during the war. In 1944, the NAACP managed to lead victory in a Supreme Court case called Smith v. Allwright, which outlawed the all-white Democratic primaries in the South. Now, since the end of the Civil War, primaries in the South have been segregated. So African Americans were not able to vote in primaries because there weren't candidates on their ballots after the Reconstruction period ended. And most African Americans, if they were able to pass the literacy test and pay a poll tax, were afraid to vote after the Reconstruction period ended. And so with this Smith v. Allwright case, we see the end of the all-white primary. So now African Americans are able to vote, at least legally, according to the federal government, in the primaries. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, established in Chicago in 1942 and initiated sit-in protests in places that refused to serve Black customers and patrons. The efforts made by African Americans in the war foreshadowed the surge of civil rights activity that was to come in the 1950s and the 1960s. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the rural South to the urban North, the West, and the urban South. But they continued to face employment discrimination, housing discrimination, and violence. In 1943, in the middle of World War II, more than 240 race riots took place in the United States, including one in Detroit that resulted in 34 deaths. The wartime brought an influx of the wartime brought an influx of immigrants from Mexico, and in 1942, the United States government made an agreement with Mexico to hire contract laborers to work in agricultural industries. Mexican Americans served in the armed forces and worked in the war industries, and the context of the war elevated their consciousness in the area of civil rights. Mexican Americans do not enjoy equal rights as well. This heightened awareness inspired Ignacio Lopez to campaign for the desegregation of movie theaters, pools, and other public accommodations. The efforts of Ignacio Lopez and this movement inspired boycotts against discriminatory companies and led to the creation of the Unity Leagues. In Texas, middle-class Mexican Americans formed the League of United Latin American Citizens, which preferred to launch boycotts only after a negotiation to end a discriminatory practice had failed. In Los Angeles, a small number of Mexican American teenagers who were frustrated with discrimination and hostility identified themselves as gang members by wearing zoot suits, which were loose-fitting jackets and padded shoulders and baggy pants. They had wide brim hats and pocket watches on chains, and they slicked back their hair. You could definitely identify someone in a zoot suit. On June 4th, 1943, again, this is during World War II. On June 4th, 1943, squads of sailors invaded Mexican-American neighborhoods in East Los Angeles and attacked whomever they encountered, including these zoot suiters. The police arrested the Mexican Americans who tried to fight back. This was known as the Zoot Suit Riots, and it lasted for 4 days. At the same time, American Indians are struggling for equal treatment as well. American Indians played a very large role in the Second World War. More than 25,000 Indians served during the military during the war. The Navajo soldiers, which you are probably familiar with, played a critical role in the Pacific Theater, where they worked to confuse and mislead Japanese intelligence efforts by sending coded messages in their tribal language, a coded message that only another Navajo could decode. Many Indians left the reservation for the very first time in their lives, finding positions and new opportunities in defense-related industries. In the context of World War II, Japanese Americans faced much greater discrimination from ordinary Americans and the government than did Italian and German Americans. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that after World War I, the German and Italian immigrants assimilated pretty quickly into the United States. Additionally, Italian and German immigrants had a longer history of immigration and acceptance in the United States. But the obvious difference, the visible physical difference that we can see in skin and stature, also made it more difficult for Japanese Americans to fully assimilate. The United States government did put 250 Italians and 11,000 Germans, including many American citizens, into internment camps, but those numbers were minuscule compared to the number of Japanese Americans who were interned. Most of the people of Japanese descent in the United States had lived along the West Coast. The government removed all of them, whether or not they were citizens. They were moved to camps in Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Idaho, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming. In Hawaii, people of Japanese descent were placed under martial law, which meant they couldn't go anywhere without expressed permission from the military. More than 100,000 people of Japanese descent, the majority of them American citizens, were placed in internment camps for the duration of the war. They lost all of their civil rights and constitutional protections because Americans were incredibly distrustful of the Japanese because of Pearl Harbor. Now, these internment camps were built almost overnight, and they were not very nice in terms of housing, but they did provide some type of dwelling accommodation. But the Japanese who owned homes, cars, and property before internment had to try very hard to sell that property quickly to make some money to recoup some type of income. Japanese Americans sold, rented, and abandoned homes and businesses. And even if they were able to rent their home, there was no guarantee that they would receive payment for their homes while they were interned. They brought with them only what they could carry and made the best of their situation in the camps. They continued to educate and entertain themselves and to worship as best they could. Some of those who were interned formed community associations, produced artwork, and wrote about their experiences in spite of their situation. More than 18,000 Japanese American men served in the army and fought in Europe, many of them serving in the 442nd Regiment, which was among the first to liberate the concentration camps in Germany. Now imagine you are a Japanese soldier. You have lost all of your property, everything, and you enlist in the United States military to hopefully prove that you're a good American. And you find yourself in Germany liberating a concentration camp. Fred Korematsu was one of the many Japanese Americans to fight internment through the courts. In 1944, after the Supreme Court denied Korematsu's appeal, Roosevelt rescinded the order which mandated internment. But when the Japanese were no longer interned, they also no longer had their homes, businesses, cars, personal items. In contrast to the Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans actually saw their situation improve during the wartime, with the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. Chinese American soldiers fought in integrated military units and worked in integrated war industries. But remember, African American soldiers still serve in segregated units. Most Japanese Americans returned to their communities at the end of the war and continued to work hard in jobs and remain loyal American citizens. But about 8,000 Japanese Americans renounced their U.S. citizenship and moved to Japan in 1945. In 1988, Congress awarded $20,000 in reparations to each of the living 60,000 internees. 10 years later, President Bill Clinton awarded Fred Korematsu the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So Japanese Americans are interned for about 3 years. They lose everything, and finally in 1988, the 60,000 who are still alive get $20,000. Here we have a picture of Hiroshima on August 6th, just after the first atomic bomb is dropped. You can see from this black and white photo the massive, massive devastation of the country and the massive amount of loss of civilian life.